Hi everyone, welcome back to the Arc'teryx Fireside Chats. I'm really excited to be with Dan Zarrilli today. And as we get started, we are both in our homes. We're still in the midst of COVID, but really thankful for Zoom for helping to connect us. So, hey Dan.
Hi, Sarah. Great to be here today.
Yeah, we actually met last year now at the Appalachian Mountain Club's annual dinner, and I heard you speak. Um, and before we get into your life, I would love to hear, or your career, I'd love to hear more about your outdoor pursuits and where you like to recreate personally in New York City.
Yeah, fantastic. I currently live in Staten Island. I've lived in three boroughs in New York City and gotten a chance to experience all the outdoors in lots of places. But right now, living in Staten Island, it's sort of it's not as well known off the island, but there are really great opportunities here for hiking, for biking, just general being outdoors in the Staten Island Greenbelt, which was one of my favorite places in the city. I live about a mile from being in the woods where there's deer and raccoons and all the other wildlife running around. And I'm also about a mile from the beach, which is nice for riding bikes and letting the kids splash in the water and just being outside. So that's really where we've been spending a lot of our outdoor time in the city, just because we live in Staten Island now. And it's really fantastic because we can get out into the woods or we can go down to the beach and just spend a lot of time outside, which right now is sorely needed.
Yeah, absolutely. That's awesome. Yeah, I love the Staten Island Greenbelt. That's one of my favorite spots as well. All right, so now on to your work. What does being New York City's Chief Climate Policy Advisor and the Director of One NYC entail? What does that mean?
Yeah, it can sound a little daunting. It boils down really to preparing New York City for the future. In a lot of ways, it's a strategic planning exercise in which we are constantly assessing what's coming at us, what's going to be coming over the horizon, and doing everything we can to move the ship of state to be better prepared for a variety of things, and really helping think through how they all fit together. And for example, as we are looking through our own strategic planning efforts, trying to assess what's happening in the world at this moment and the trend lines of, what's our economy look like and what does population growth look like in the city? What's the long-term impacts of our infrastructure and the challenges of, decades of prior disinvestment that have happened in the city over the past, and we're still dealing with the impacts of that. And then overlaying some of the more global trends that are happening and things like, well, sea levels are clearly rising in New York City. They've already risen a foot, and they're since 1900, they're going to projected to rise as much as 2.5 feet by 2050, maybe as much as 6 feet or even higher by 2100. How to think about what all those mean for the city, and we've seen the impacts of a Hurricane Sandy, and so really thinking hard about the impacts of climate change and how it's going to overlay on top of our existing infrastructure, our core systems, and thinking about things like public health threats or cybersecurity and all the other things that are out there. It's trying to put all that together, and certainly last but not least in this is thinking about how it hits all this means in our communities and the social equity concerns of our communities, and how the disproportionate effects of things like pandemics and climate change are bearing a brunt on our most marginalized communities. And so what we do and what this job and our team is really all about is doing the strategic planning, the communications campaigns, developing the partnerships to address all those challenges and really point us in the direction of being a stronger and more fair city. And of course, there's an overlay here of we are in office now for another 18 months, but we're setting long-term targets. We're trying to make sure that we are handing off to the next team these initiatives in place so that people who are going to come after us are able to hit some of these long-term targets, but we're doing everything we can in the near term to change policy, pull the levers that we have at our disposal in order to make sure that we are pointing ourselves in that right direction. And that turns into things like changing our building codes and our zoning codes. It means investing in our infrastructure. It's putting the pieces together and identifying how all across and with our entire One NYC program, or what we think of as our Green New Deal, which touches topics like education and healthcare and the state of our democracy, and how those align with the needs that we have from our our infrastructure investments that are needed for our climate resilience, our climate sustainability work that needs to happen, and really just putting all of it together into a coherent whole so that we can actually move the city government and ultimately the entire city towards where we need to be over the next several decades.
So can you tell us a little bit more about what One NYC entails?
Sure. So One NYC is really New York City's long-term strategic plan. We have a legislation in place in New York City that requires that the mayor's office conduct strategic planning and put out a long-term plan every 4 years. And, it lines up nicely with the sort of terms of each mayor. And so every mayor has a chance to put their imprint and allow the plan to evolve, which is pretty smart and savvy of the folks who set that up initially. And what it means is we need to be able to look at things like the trends that are facing New York City, our population, our economy, all of those sort of core underlying pieces, and think about the individual and unique threats that face New York City. And that can come in the form of social equity concerns. It can come in the form of climate change. It can be things like our infrastructure. And we put together plans, initiatives, actions, investments in order to respond to those challenges. And so One NYC really boils down to being our long-term strategic plan, and the way we've crafted it, it also pretty much is New York City's Green New Deal. So it's in this moment we are thinking about confronting our climate crisis, addressing the health and wealth inequities that face our city, and doing everything we can to strengthen our democracy, because we don't fix so many of these bigger problems if we're not, especially at a national level, able to fix our democracy.
Thank you. And so how did the vision of One NYC come about?
Yeah, we did a lot of listening. I think it starts first with listening and understanding the data. And we did a really deep data dive all across the city administration to understand, the trends that people are seeing, all the census data, all the data on job trends and the economy, our infrastructure, how people are getting around the city. We did a really deep look at all of the data. And then, it's not enough to stop there. We went out and listened to New Yorkers. And so we were out in literally every neighborhood, every single zip code in New York City, either in person or online, and in 11 languages. We got thousands and thousands of comments to surveys. We did events at different transit hubs and different places where people gather. And so we did a lot of listening to understand what the concerns are that New Yorkers are facing. And maybe not surprisingly, when we did this in 2019, the top concerns were around transportation, around housing, education, public safety. But it's really interesting to start seeing, big, large-scale issues like climate change and the environment start to really tick up on that list. Because the list itself is very much like the bread and butter sort of issues of being a New Yorker. How do I get around? Can I afford to stay in my neighborhood? All of those sort of issues that are rightly top of mind. And also seeing that New Yorkers are getting more and more concerned about, rising sea levels and the impacts of storms. And they lived through Hurricane Sandy and they've experienced the heat in our summers. And that's starting to really become something that is a core issue to New Yorkers as well. And, taking all of that information, everything we heard from the data, everything we heard from New Yorkers, we pulled that into an integrated strategy that really connects the community resilience needs, the things like improving our education and the equity and excellence in our school system, to our healthcare system and the things that we're doing to provide healthcare to all New Yorkers, and all the way across to making sure that New Yorkers are responding to the census, that we are investing in the kind of clean energy needs we have as a city, that we are expanding our mobility across the city, and making our streets safer. All of this, how it fits together, which is what laid out the Green New Deal, the long-term strategic plan for New York City, and put it all together in a way that I think is really approachable about how we're, ultimately at our core, confronting our climate crisis, addressing the health and wealth inequities that we see in our city, and strengthening our democracy. And those three themes really come through loud and clear as we talk about One NYC all the time, and as we've really been moving it forward.
Yeah. And so New York City being completely carbon neutral in 2050 seems ambitious to me. What is the biggest challenge to hitting that goal?
Yeah, it's a funny thing that I think we've seen in the climate space where there's a version of this where those goals are really, really ambitious and really hard to hit, and those goals are really essential and necessary. And the longer that we wait in, doing the things that are necessary to hit them, the harder they become. And so we see this, we see being carbon neutral as by 2050 as, that's what the science demands of us. That's what it's going to mean in order for us to be part of the solution of hitting the Paris Agreement. We have to get this done. But we are not blind to the challenges that we're going to face in hitting that. And so as we've been breaking it down, first we had to understand where are all of our carbon emissions coming from, and we publish an annual inventory with those numbers. And we've known for a long time that buildings are our biggest source of carbon pollution in New York City. And that has led to a whole range of work around upgrading our construction codes, energy efficiency measures, and most recently, Local Law 97, which is a world-leading building retrofit mandate. So now buildings, existing buildings have to retrofit to use less energy, and they have clear deadlines and they have clear penalties if they don't meet it. And that's the kind of investment where, it's what's necessary to get rid of our carbon pollution. It's going to create a ton of jobs for all those retrofit work that has to happen, and really fits in well with our thinking about what it means to have a Green New Deal. That's one piece of it. The other is making sure that the energy that we are supplying into our city is clean, and we have a 100% clean electricity target by 2040. We are, we have grown solar in the city almost tenfold since 2013. There are big plans on the books and in partnership with the state to secure offshore wind to bring into New York City, and we've been doing a lot of work to secure hydropower as well, to make sure that all of the electricity that we have in New York City by 2040 is clean and renewable. And what this does is it helps also create an enormous amount of jobs. It's like real job creating investments that can also help us address environmental justice in our city. The more clean energy that we can bring into the city, the sooner we can start turning off the dirty generation that's in our city, and primarily in our overburdened communities. It's a real environmental injustice that we've seen with air quality and particulate matter. And so the faster that we can move on this, the sooner that we can remove those sources of pollution in our city directly.
So your title is that you're the Chief Climate Policy Advisor, but it sounds like you're doing a large range of things. You mentioned equity and democracy. How does that all fit under a climate policy title?
Well, so climate is one of those issues that touches everything. And so, I'm not sitting here telling you that, all the things that we have to do in our education system, our healthcare, or with our democracy are my direct responsibility. I have a lot of great colleagues that do a lot of great work on this. But I think it's under One NYC, it was necessary to really highlight how these things fit together, and know that as we are acting on climate, we need to be cognizant of these other things, and we need to partner with the other leaders across the administration and across the city that are helping us achieve these goals. And so it's absolutely necessary to take a broad look when you talk about climate, because too often I think the climate conversation can get bogged down in the sort of technocratic details of, energy supply and transmission requirements, and all really important things, because we need to solve those technical challenges. But if you lose sight of the human needs in all of this, and the social equity considerations, and just even the clear recognition that when the climate impacts happen, they're going to have a disproportionate effect on our poorer communities, on communities of color. We saw that during Sandy, we see that during heat season. And so those things also have other underlying conditions and prior environmental injustices that have led us to that place. And so it's necessary to grapple with the entirety of our neighborhoods, the makeup of our neighborhoods, the education system, the whole piece of it that allows us to really deal with the complexity of climate change. And yes, not just the physical impacts of what's going to happen when our climate is changing, and we've already locked in a lot of changes, and that's going to bring more heat and more storms and more sea level rise, all of that. But it's also going to have enormous impacts in our communities, on food insecurity, on public health. And so you can't just narrowly look at climate change as like an energy set of issues. You need to understand how those sort of more technocratic energy issues fit into a larger vision of how a city works. And I think that's what we've been working to do through One NYC. And I think it's incredibly complicated, but it's the right way to approach the problem and to build a larger coalition to deal with these issues here locally, but also regionally and really globally.
Yeah, and thank you for helping to share your work in this very complex nature in 20 minutes with me. So I appreciate that.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And obviously we're living in a challenging time that many of us never expected, especially if your work is in strategy. So has COVID specifically influenced or changed the One NYC strategy?
Well, it's certainly made everything a little more complicated, or maybe even a lot more complicated. I think, we've seen some really devastating impacts here in New York City with over 20,000 New Yorkers that have died from COVID. We've seen massive unemployment, particularly in our, really a lot of our lower wage sectors. And so we're going to be dealing with the impacts of this for quite some time. And the recovery on this is going to be really difficult, and it's going to probably consume the rest of this mayoral administration, all the different actions that are going to need to happen to make sure that we are recovering from this and doing it in a smart way. It was really important, though, and the mayor a few weeks ago announced a number of our recovery efforts, and specifically named climate and environmental justice as being center to the recovery efforts that we are undertaking. And we also stood with, I think the number is now 36 mayors across the globe, to endorse a set of recovery principles that really put equity and climate action and environmental justice at the heart of all of our plans to recover from this, because we know that's what's going to be necessary to accelerate an economic recovery. We need job creating investments, and we can't lose sight of our looming climate crisis as we're dealing with this public health crisis. But they're not unrelated, and one can actually help us deal with the other. And at this moment when we are facing unemployment that's at Great Depression levels here in the United States, the kind of investments that we can put into clean energy, into resilient infrastructure, into environmental justice can help create the jobs that we're going to need to really accelerate this economic recovery and get America back on track. And so we think that there's this can't we can't distract ourselves from the climate crisis. We need to absorb the lessons of what's going on right now in our world and make sure that we are firmly fixed on fix our vision on dealing with the climate crisis, because it is both of these things, the public health crisis, the climate crisis, is really a challenge to the disparities, the injustices that we have in our city. We know who's getting hit hardest and worst and first from all of these impacts, and the kinds of things we can do to address our climate crisis is exactly what we need to do to recover from this COVID crisis.
Yeah. And so for individuals who are New York City residents, what is one thing that maybe all of us can do to be part of the movement and support One NYC?
Yeah, I think it's a great question, and we grapple with this in One NYC, and actually at the back of each chapter, there's a whole set of things that people can do, and it's everything from make sure you fill out your census, make sure you're signed up to vote, talk to your neighbors and family about the importance of climate action and environmental justice, and there's a whole range of things that we can bring people in, and I usually point people to Green YC, which is our sort of the channels in which we put out information to New Yorkers on the choices they can make to live a more sustainable lifestyle. There's any number of things like that, but I think it really does come down to like those core issues of our democracy and filling out the census, making sure New York is getting the resources it needs, making sure you're signed up to vote and you use your voice in the right way, and talk to your neighbors about these issues.
Awesome. Thank you, Dan. And I just wanted to close with some more information for everyone who wants to learn more about New York City's Green New Deal. You can head to onenyc.cityofnewyork.us.